Hello, John Tennison here. I wanted to share with you another excerpt from the November 22nd, 2014 question and answer session with James Presley at his book reception for his book, The Phantom Killer. During that book reception, Mr. Jereme Kennington asked James Presley a question about Betty Jo Booker's saxophone, which appears to have been found on October the 24th of 1946 and publicized the next day on the front page of the Texarkana Gazette on Friday, October 25th of 1946. What you're looking at this in front of you is the front page of the Texarkana Gazette from October the 25th of 1946, which was a Friday. The headline of the paper, which you cannot see in this image, states, "Saxophone found in weeds identified as horn belonging to phantom victim." Bear in mind, this was on the front page of the Texarkana Gazette. Below that headline is a smaller headline which says, "Farm Laborers Uncover Clue in Mystery Slaying." The first two paragraphs of the article then go on to read, quote, "A tarnished gold saxophone lying exposed in the rotting blue plush lining of a leather carrying case was discovered by two fence repairers on secluded Morris Lane Thursday morning, and local officers accepted positive identification which stamped the weather-beaten clue as belonging to Betty Jo Booker, 15, fourth victim in Texarkana's phantom murders." And then the next paragraph says, quote, "The long-lost instrument, which for 6 months needled officers as the most mysterious link in the Twin Cities string of tragedies, was found by farm laborers only 140 steps from the spot where the popular high school student's body was found on the morning of Sunday, April 14th. End of paragraph. So as you can see, based on this article, which was a front page article on October 25th, 1946, the fact that the saxophone had been found was highly publicized. Yet, for some unusual reason, James Presley, in his book, insists that there was no way that Peggy Swinney could have known about the saxophone. I disagree. Not only could she have known about it because it had been publicized, she could have learned about that publicity from her own lawyer or from one of the several interrogators that she had. In fact, an FBI document from 1947 clarifies that Peggy Swinney had at least 12 different interrogators, and that's in addition to her lawyer. So between her lawyer and between the possibility of the interrogators, one or more of them, asking leading questions, it's clearly plausible that Peggy could have known about the saxophone, yet at the same time, people continue to assert and assume, despite the October 1946 article, that Peggy somehow led authorities to the location of the saxophone. Another consideration which is consistent with Peggy not having known the location of Betty Jo Booker's saxophone comes from considering the timeline from when Peggy was first arrested and incarcerated to when the saxophone was found, and also considering the ways in which the various statements attributed to Peggy change over that course of time. I want to be very clear that I'm of the opinion that the statements attributed to Peggy are almost certainly not her verbatim comments, but instead were generated in other ways through the interrogation process. Nonetheless, we can see how those statements change in accordance with what the authorities knew about the saxophone at the time. So let's examine this timeline. On June the 28th of 1946, Peggy was arrested and incarcerated. Then there was a statement or narrative attributed to her dated July 23rd of 1946 at 11:10 a.m. This particular statement had no mention of shootings, Spring Lake Park, a boy, a girl, the Stockman Hotel, or of a saxophone. Then the following day, on July 24th, 1946, at 10:10 p.m., a third narrative was attributed to Peggy, which stated, quote, "He then looked into the coupe and found a large black leather case in the car, comma, he put this case into our car in the trunk, period," close quote. There's no mention of a saxophone throwing or of a fence in this statement. At this particular time, authorities believed that the saxophone was still in possession of a person who was likely to try to take it to a pawn shop, and as a result there had been a memo put out to pawn shop owners to be on the lookout for Betty Jo Booker's saxophone. However, as I've already stated, on October 25th, 1946, the fact of Betty Jo Booker's saxophone having been found was highly publicized on the front page of the Texarkana Gazette. It had been found the previous day, Thursday, October 24th. Now, in accordance with that new knowledge, a new narrative comes into being, which is dated November 22nd, 1946, which states, quote, "He got out of the car and threw the saxophone on the right-hand side of the road. He threw it over the fence, period. I think there were some bushes there, period," close quote. So now you see the new statement and the new narrative is in accordance with what the authorities had discovered on October 24th, and which was publicized on October 25th of 1946. Some people have suggested that the change in the narratives attributed to Peggy was simply a function of the interrogators gradually getting a more truthful statement out of Peggy. But a plausible explanation for what happened could be that Peggy's statements, or at least the statements attributed to her, change in accordance with what the authorities themselves knew at the time, and were not necessarily reflective of any prior knowledge that Peggy had brought with her at the time that she was arrested on June 28th of 1946. I now want to consider inconsistencies suggestive of Peggy Swinney's attempts to comply with a narrative introduced to her by interrogators and/or from prior publicized facts rather than from knowledge that she possessed prior to her arrest on June 28th of 1946. I've already made mention to narrative number 4, which is said to have occurred or have been generated on November 22nd, 1946. It states, quote, "He got out of the car and threw the saxophone on the right-hand side of the road, period. He threw it over the fence, period. I think there were some bushes there, period," close quote. Also said to have been generated on that same date of November 22nd, 1946, but after the narrative number 4 was generated, is the Mclaughlin Transcript. The Mclaughlin Transcript is said to be a transcript of a conversation that occurred between the polygraph tester Glenn Mclaughlin and Peggy Swinney. It's particularly important to remember that this transcript is said to have been generated after narrative number 4. If narrative number 4 was actually generated from Peggy's own memory, and if she was reviewing or continuing to review that same material on the same date, you would think she would have been every bit as confident during the Mclaughlin conversation as she had been during narrative number 4. Yet she is not. So let me now read the parts of the Mclaughlin transcript to make that case. Mclaughlin says, quote, "Where did he throw the saxophone? Question mark. Peggy says, quote, "On the right-hand side of the road, period. I don't know just whereabouts." Mclaughlin then says, quote, "Did he throw it over the fence, or was it on the same side of the fence that the road was on? Question mark. Peggy now says, "Over the fence, I think." That's kind of interesting because in narrative number 4, it definitively states he threw it over the fence. But yet now in the Mclaughlin conversation, occurring on that same day, but later in that day, she says, "Over the fence, I think." So it's peculiar because she doesn't seem to be as certain in her conversation with Mr. Mclaughlin as the statement attributed to her makes her sound. If we then continue the Mclaughlin transcript, Glenn Mclaughlin then says, quote, "And Swinney took an object out of the car?" Peggy says, quote, "Yes, sir." Mclaughlin, quote, "And that object was what?" Peggy, quote, "Well, I guess it was a saxophone. I didn't see it, just the case." Mclaughlin, quote, "It was a saxophone case, and then he put that in his car?" Peggy, quote, "Yes, sir." Now, first I want to point out that the Mclaughlin transcript has been alleged by some to actually be the polygraph testing questions themselves. I seriously doubt that was the case. However, if it was, then it was not following appropriate polygraph protocol. in which the tester is only supposed to ask single yes or no questions at a time. In this case, he asked 2 back-to-back yes or no questions, and she said, "Yes, sir," but since only one yes answer was given, it's not clear to which question she's answering yes to. But the more important point that I wanted to make in this particular video was that this Mclaughlin transcript demonstrates Peggy's lack of familiarity with what was previously represented in narrative number 4 as Peggy's certainty of an object being a saxophone and of that object being thrown over the fence. If the 4th narrative were Peggy's own truthful words, it makes no sense that Peggy would have become less confident in the same day of these facts. On November 22nd of 2014, Mr. Jereme Kennington, who you see pictured here holding a copy of James Presley's book, The Phantom Killer, asks James Presley a question about Peggy Swinney's knowledge of the location of Betty Jo Booker's saxophone. Mr. Presley gives an answer indicating that he does not think Peggy would have had a way to have known what had been publicized on the front page of the Texarkana Gazette. Here now is the footage of the question asked by Jereme Kennington and the answer given by James Presley.
I was going to read a sentence and have a question. I was going to read a sentence from your book and ask the question. It says, Peggy's recall of the saxophone's disposal meshed almost exactly with the facts of its discovery, the details of which she had not been informed. And my question was, how do we know she hadn't been informed, and with what certainty?
Hadn't been informed of what?
On the details of the saxophone being found.
Well, that was, how would she have known about it?
It was printed in the October paper.
Yeah, it was, but that was, she didn't have access to that.